He was the most beloved man in Hollywood. A rapper who became a movie star who became a legend. The Fresh Prince, the last man on earth, the king of the box office. And then, in 9 seconds, it was over. But here's what they never told you. The slap wasn't where the story ends. It was where it began to unravel. Because when you pull back the curtain on Will Smith's life, really pull it back, what you find isn't just a bad night at the Oscars. What you find is a man who had been crumbling quietly for years. A man who built an empire on an image that was never quite real. A man who, the moment the cameras caught him losing control, revealed what the empire was always sitting on: sand. This is the story of Will Smith. Not the version he sold you, the real one. Let's go back to the beginning, because you cannot understand the fall without understanding how impossibly high the climb was. Willard Carroll Smith Jr. was born on September 25, 1968, in West Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His father, Willard Sr., was a refrigerator engineer who ran his own business. His mother, Caroline, worked for the Philadelphia School Board. They were working class, stable, black, and proud. The family lived in Winnefield, a neighborhood that was middle class but bordered rough edges. Will grew up understanding very early that the world had a version of you it expected, and a version of you that you had to fight to show instead. His grandmother called him Prince, not as a nickname, as a declaration. She saw something in him that she wanted the world to see too. And Will Smith spent the next 40 years trying to live up to it. At school, he was the kid everyone liked, charismatic in a way that felt almost supernatural. Teachers noticed it. Classmates noticed it. He had an ability to read a room, to make people laugh, to deflect tension with a smile. It was a gift. It was also, as we'll come to understand, armor. He was accepted to MIT. He chose not to go. Instead, he chose music, and at 16 years old, he met a DJ named Jeffrey Towns at a party. They called themselves DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. And within 2 years, they were on the radio. In 1988, they won the very first Grammy ever awarded for Best Rap Performance for Parents Just Don't Understand. Will Smith was 19 years old. He was on top of the world. And then he blew it. The IRS came for Will Smith before he was even 25. This is the part of the story that most people skip over, but it matters enormously because it explains everything about the psychological prison that Will Smith would spend the next 3 decades trying to escape. By the early 1990s, Smith had made millions from his music career, and he spent almost all of it: jewelry, cars, an enormous entourage. A lifestyle built entirely on the idea that success meant excess. He hadn't learned how to manage money. No one had taught him. And when the IRS came calling, they came with a bill for approximately $2.8 million in back taxes. At his peak, Will Smith had his assets seized. His royalties, his possessions gone. He was, by all legal and financial measures, broke. Most people don't recover from that. Most people, especially young black men in America who had clawed their way to the top, don't get a second act. Will Smith got 3. The rescue came in the form of a TV show. A producer named Benny Medina had an idea, a fish-out-of-water sitcom about a kid from West Philadelphia who moves in with his wealthy relatives in Bel Air. He pitched it to Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones got a meeting with NBC, and Benny Medina needed a star. He found one at a party. He watched Will Smith work a room and knew immediately. The Fresh Prince of Bel Air premiered on September 10, 1990. It ran for 6 seasons. It made Will Smith one of the most recognizable faces on American television. But more than that, it gave him something that would define his entire career. It made him safe. Safe for white audiences. Safe for black audiences. Safe for corporate sponsors. Will Smith on The Fresh Prince was funny, charming, non-threatening, and aspirational all at once. He was the perfect product for the early 1990s. And Will Smith understood that. He understood it with the precision of an engineer. He studied it. He analyzed it. He reverse-engineered stardom with a methodical intelligence that people often underestimated because he wrapped it in a smile. Years later, he would reveal that he had studied the highest-grossing films of all time and noticed a pattern. They almost all featured one of 3 things: a love story, special effects, or comedians. He decided he would be the comedian. He would make movies so big, so universally appealing, that no one could deny him. The strategy worked. My God, did it work. Bad Boys in 1995, Independence Day in 1996, Men in Black in 1997, Enemy of the State in 1998, Wild Wild West in 1999. 5 years, 5 blockbusters. By the turn of the millennium, Will Smith was the biggest movie star on the planet. Not in some specific demographic, not in some specific genre, but everywhere, for everyone. He was the first actor to have 8 consecutive films gross over $100 million at the domestic box office. He was statistically the most bankable star in Hollywood history at that point. And yet, there was always an "and yet" with Will Smith. Even at the height of his commercial dominance, the critical establishment kept its distance. He was too commercial, too crowd-pleasing, too safe. The Oscar voters, who rewarded complexity and darkness and psychological depth, looked at Will Smith's filmography and saw a man who was excellent at making people happy, and they treated that as if it were a flaw. Will Smith wanted more. He always wanted more. In 2001, he made Ali. He trained for a year and a half. He gained 35 pounds of muscle. He didn't just play Muhammad Ali. He dismantled himself and rebuilt himself in Ali's image. The performance earned him his first Academy Award nomination. He didn't win. Denzel Washington won that year for Training Day. In 2006, he made The Pursuit of Happiness. He played a homeless single father fighting to give his son a better life. It was raw, real, and devastating. He earned his second Oscar nomination. He didn't win. Forrest Whitaker won that year for The Last King of Scotland. 2 nominations, no wins. And with each loss, something shifted in Will Smith. A hunger that had always been there, that had always been part of his engine, began to transform into something darker. Something closer to desperation. The king needed his crown. Now, before we go any further, we have to talk about Jada. Because you cannot tell the story of Will Smith's rise and fall without telling the story of Willard and Jada Pinkett Smith. Not because their marriage is tabloid fodder, but because their marriage is, in many ways, the psychological core of everything that comes next. Will met Jada Pinkett in 1990 when she auditioned for a role on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. She didn't get the part. She was considered too short. But they stayed in contact. They became friends. And after Will's first marriage to Cherie Zampino ended in 1995, he and Jada began dating. They married on December 31st, 1997, New Year's Eve, the end of one era, the beginning of another. By all public appearances, they were Hollywood royalty. Beautiful, successful, brilliant, powerful. They had 2 children together. Jaden, born in 1998, and Willow, born in 2000. They were a family. But underneath the surface of that perfect image, there were fault lines. Jada Pinkett Smith was never a woman who was going to disappear into someone else's story. She was fiercely independent, intensely intellectual, and deeply unconventional in her thinking. She had her own career, acting, music, producing. She had her own spiritual and philosophical journey, which would lead her in directions that the public, frankly, was not prepared for. And Will Smith, the man who had built his entire identity around being universally loved, around being the safe, charming, perfect hero, was married to a woman who didn't believe in performing for anyone's comfort. The tension between those 2 realities was slow-burning and invisible to the outside world for years. And then, eventually, it wasn't invisible at all. Here is the twist that changes everything. In 2020, Jada Pinkett Smith sat down for an episode of her Facebook Watch series Red Table Talk. She had been at the center of rumors for months. Specifically, rumors about an entanglement with a young singer named August Alsina. August Alsina had publicly stated that he had been in a romantic relationship with Jada, and that Will Smith had given his blessing. The internet exploded. The Smiths had always presented themselves as a deeply committed couple. Now there was a man on the record claiming otherwise. And so Jada sat down, and Will sat down beside her. And on camera, in front of millions of viewers, the conversation happened. Jada confirmed the relationship with August Alsina. She described it as an entanglement. She spoke about being in a different place in her life. She spoke about her own healing journey. And Will Smith, the biggest movie star in the world, The man whose entire persona was built on confidence and control and effortless dominance, sat in that chair and appeared, to anyone watching, to be completely shattered. He described feeling devastated. He was visibly uncomfortable. He was a man who had spent his entire life managing every room he was ever in, and he could not manage this one. The Red Table Talk interview was watched by tens of millions of people. And what most of those people saw, though they might not have named it this precisely, was a man whose armor had cracked. A man whose carefully constructed image had been breached from the inside. And here is the haunting question that moment planted: was Will Smith's famous confidence always a performance? Was the Fresh Prince charming, unshakable, impossible to beat? A character he had created to survive a world that had tried to take everything from him? And if so, what happened when the performance became too expensive to maintain? The years between 2020 and 2022 were, by Will Smith's own account, among the most difficult of his life. He had turned 50 in 2018 and described falling into a deep depression. He wrote about it in his 2021 memoir, Will, with a candor that surprised almost everyone who had followed his career. He described his father's abuse, both physical and emotional. He described the terror of watching his father, who had suffered a stroke, and realizing that he could push the wheelchair down a set of stairs and no one would know. He described the intrusive thought as a sign of how much pain he had been carrying. He described his marriage as a relationship built on two people who loved each other and also hurt each other repeatedly across decades. He described an unconventional approach to their relationship, what he called an attempt to release the expectations of traditional monogamy. He described, in plain language, a man in crisis. The memoir was critically praised. It was raw and honest in ways that public figures almost never are. And reading between the lines, it told a story that the blockbusters and the red carpets and the chart-topping singles had obscured for 30 years. Will Smith was not the man the world thought he knew. He was someone far more complicated, far more wounded, and far more searching. The question was, could that searching lead somewhere good? And then came March 27, 2022, the 94th Academy Awards, the Dolby Theater in Los Angeles. The most watched award ceremony on earth. Will Smith was nominated for Best Actor for his performance as Richard Williams, the father of Venus and Serena Williams in King Richard. It was arguably the best performance of his career. Critics were unified. The momentum was overwhelming. After 2 nominations and 2 losses, the night felt, finally, like Will Smith's moment. Presenter Chris Rock took the stage. Chris Rock, who had a complicated relationship with the Smiths, he had made jokes about Jada before, and not kindly. In 2016, when Jada participated in the #OscarSoWhite boycott, Rock had made pointed remarks about her at that very ceremony. Rock looked out at the audience. He looked at Jada Pinkett Smith, who had shaved her head, a response to her alopecia, a condition that causes hair loss, and one she had spoken publicly about. And Rock made a joke. He compared her to Demi Moore in G.I. Jane, a movie in which Moore's character shaves her head. In the audience, Will Smith laughed. We know this because it is on camera on the broadcast, seen by millions. He laughed. And then he looked at Jada. And Jada was not laughing. Jada's expression, in the immortal and devastating footage, was one of cool, contained fury. What happened next took 9 seconds. Will Smith rose from his seat. He walked onto the stage. He walked up to Chris Rock. And he slapped him, open-palmed, across the face, hard enough that the sound carried through the microphone. Then he walked back to his seat, and he sat down, and from across the theater he shouted, twice, for Rock to keep his wife's name out of his mouth. The room was silent. The cameras captured faces, stunned, confused, disbelieving. Several audience members appeared to think it was a bit, a staged moment. It was not staged. 20 minutes later, Will Smith won Best Actor. He walked to the stage. He wept. He gave a speech about protecting the people he loved, about the position of being a vessel for love and light, about Richard Williams being a fierce defender of his family. He received a standing ovation, and the world watched, collectively trying to process what it had just witnessed. The fallout was immediate and seismic. By the next morning, the slap was the only thing anyone was talking about. Not the films that won, not the performances that were celebrated. The slap. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences launched an investigation. Within days, it was revealed that Will Smith had been asked to leave the ceremony after the incident and had refused. The Academy's Board of Governors held an emergency meeting, and on April 8, 2022, 12 days after the ceremony, the Academy announced that Will Smith was banned from attending the Oscars or any other Academy event for 10 years. Will Smith had already resigned his membership. The professional consequences cascaded. Netflix paused a film it had been developing with him. Sony put a planned sequel to Bad Boys on hold. Apple paused post-production on a film he had already completed. His talent agency, CAA, which had represented him for years, began distancing itself from future projects. The man who had been the most bankable star in Hollywood history was, suddenly, unbookable. But the cultural consequences were more complex and more revealing of who we are as an audience, as much as who Will Smith is as a man. Because the conversation that erupted was not simply Will Smith did a bad thing. It was a national argument, a global argument about black male anger and respectability politics, about alopecia and public humiliation, about what it means to defend your partner, about whether the punishment fit the crime, about comedy and cruelty, about the line between a man protecting his wife and a man performing his masculinity for an audience of billions. People chose sides with a ferocity that revealed how much this moment had touched something pre-existing and raw. The slap became a Rorschach test. What you saw in it depended entirely on what you had brought with you. Will Smith retreated. For months after the Oscars, he was essentially invisible. He went to India, he meditated, he isolated. Sources close to him described a man in profound shame and confusion, not entirely unlike the man he had described in his memoir. The boy from West Philadelphia who had learned very early that the world could take everything from you, and who had spent his entire adult life trying to make himself untakeable. He had not been untakeable. The boy who had been taught by his father, by a man who, Will wrote, once punched his mother and knocked her unconscious, that violence was power, had, in a single unguarded moment, reached for the only tool that original wound had ever offered him. The armor had cracked, then it had shattered, and what was underneath was not the Fresh Prince. In July 2022, he posted a video apology to Chris Rock. It was notable for several reasons. He appeared unpolished, slightly disheveled, a far cry from the immaculate, camera-ready Will Smith the world was accustomed to. He said he had reached out to Rock directly and that Rock was not ready to talk. Chris Rock, for his part, addressed the slap extensively in his 2023 Netflix special Selective Outrage. He was pointed, personal, and at times vicious. He rejected the framing of Will Smith as a man defending his wife's honor. He described the experience in terms of genuine hurt and public humiliation. Rock also said he was not a victim. He said he was going to handle the pain in his own way. The two men have not, as of this telling, reconciled publicly. In November 2023, Will Smith returned to public view with a new music video, his first new music in years. You Can Make It was a gospel-inflected, inspirational song featuring a choir. The reception was mixed. Some saw it as a genuine attempt at redemption. Others found it premature. Others found it tone-deaf. In 2024, he released the film Emancipation, which had been completed before the slap but sat in limbo during the controversy. Apple eventually released it. The reviews were solid. The film had no meaningful awards traction, despite early predictions that it would be a major contender. The machine that had elevated Will Smith for 3 decades, the industry relationships, the media goodwill, the cultural positioning, was not merely paused. It was reconfiguring. He had always understood how the machine worked. He had reverse engineered it, he had studied it, beaten it, made himself indispensable to it. But the machine operated on trust. And trust, once broken in public, in front of a global audience, on the most watched night in Hollywood, is not easily repaired. There is a version of this story that ends here: the fallen king, the empire in ruins, the warning tale. But Will Smith's story has never been a simple one, and it would be dishonest to close it that cleanly. Because here's what remains true. Will Smith is one of the most talented entertainers of his generation. His arc from broke teenager to global icon is, by any measure, extraordinary. His memoir revealed a depth of self-awareness and willingness to reckon with his own wounds that most public figures never come close to. His best performances, Ali, Chris Gardner in Pursuit of Happiness, Richard Williams in King Richard, are genuinely great. And the forces that led to that night at the Oscars, the trauma, the ego, the desperate need for love and validation, the marriage lived under a pressure most of us will never understand, the hunger for the crown that kept being placed just out of reach. Those forces were not created in a vacuum. They were created by a life. A hard, brilliant, messy, human life. The question Hollywood is now asking, and the question the audience is negotiating in real time, is whether a second act is possible. Whether the man who rebuilt himself from bankruptcy, from obscurity, from 2 Oscar losses, from decades of public and private pain, has enough material to build one more version of himself. Will Smith has done it before, 3 times. But each time, he had the machine on his side. This time, he doesn't. And so we are left with the question that haunts this entire story, the one that doesn't resolve cleanly, no matter how long you sit with it. Was Will Smith's transformation, the memoir, the vulnerability, the cracks in the armor, a genuine evolution, or was it one more performance? One more version of the image management that had defined his entire career? Did Will Smith finally, truly let the world see him? Or did he let the world see a more sophisticated version of the character he had always been playing? The Fresh Prince, at his core, was always a story about a kid pretending to belong somewhere he didn't, about performing confidence until the world believed it, about turning the armor into the identity until you couldn't tell the difference between the two. Nobody, not even Will Smith, may know the answer to that question. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing about him. If this story moved you, if you've ever watched someone you admired fall from a height and wondered what was really underneath, then the video on your screen right now was made for you. I promise you it goes just as deep. Watch it.